My name is Don Linky. It is the morning of July 12, 2007. We're here on the campus of Rutgers University in New Brunswick at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. This is another in the series of interviews for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive program being conducted by the Institute for the Rutgers Program on the Governor. This is a continuation in our series of interviews with Jeffrey Laurenti. Jeff, at the end of our last session, we had discussed the various episodes which led to the enactment of the income tax and the school reform package in the summer of 1976. I'd like to start today and talk more generally about the institutional relationships of the legislature, the governor, and to some extent the judiciary in terms of what they were like then and what they're like now and how things have changed or not changed. How do you sort of see it in terms of legislative power? You had mentioned early in our series that the legislature, when Brendan Byrne was first elected in 1973, was beginning to increase its staff capacity, I think you used the term friskiness of feeling its oats in terms of strengthening its power, and has over the time, has that trend toward a stronger legislature continued, or is it somehow weakened or stabilized?
Well, there's no doubt that the movement to strengthen legislative power and strengthen the role of legislators in New Jersey government, as it was happening in many other states at that time, was surging through the late 60s and peaked probably in the 70s. You had the legislative oversight movement. Then Senator Raymond Zane had been a very strong promoter of legislation to require or to give the legislature the power to invalidate rules and regulations adopted by executive agencies that offended the legislature in some way simply by passage of a concurrent resolution. And this became an issue that bedeviled us during the 70s as an ultimate power grab. But you had already developing, as you just recollected, a serious legislative staff capacity. When you think of the world before 1970 in New Jersey, legislators were basically picked by county chairmen and did not see themselves as having earned their position in the legislature by dint of their own contact with their constituents so much as by dint of their relationship to their county political leaders and political organizations. They were down in Trenton 2 afternoons a week, if that often. Power basically lay much more in the hands of the executive, not because the Constitution put that power in the executive's hands, but because the legislature was very weak in its capacity and probably not particularly anxious to develop it. You did have, I think, the first stirrings in New Jersey of a sense of legislative differentness after Governor Hughes and his Democratic majorities in the 1966-67 legislature were blown out in the 67 election, and you had 3-1 Republican majorities in both houses that saw themselves as empowered to chart a different direction. And this was the first, I think, in New Jersey's 20th century history, the first stirrings of a separate legislative consciousness. They had a mandate, a huge mandate, to run the state differently than Hughes's direction would be, and they sought to try to implement that. But within 2 years, they then had a governor of their own party, and in that sense, what had been the political motivation dissipated instantly. But you did have, with Ray Bateman and in particular as the champion, the development of a legislative staff, the creation of an executive director of the state Senate and state assembly as the first full-time staff position. They had had none, which then became the seed around which a whole forest would grow within the next 10 to 15 years. Secondly, a reduction in the number of committees and a surprising requirement that committees actually meet. Till that time, bills would be referred to committees, but the committees would not usually meet. Rather, when the Senate Republican caucus decided that there was a bill that it was ready to vote on, a sign-out sheet was sent in which you got a majority of the members of the committee that nominally had control of this bill, and they would, on the floor of the Senate, just sign it out. So the requirement of committees meeting. So this was already underway before the Byrne landslide and the elevation now of 3 to 1 Democratic majorities in the Senate, 4 to 1 in the Assembly for that first legislature serving with Brendan Byrne. The relations, I think we talked about this before in terms of the interpersonal relations of the governor's first term chief political and policy advisors and leaders in the legislature. There is one important institutional change that resulted from the way in which the administration conducted business in the Byrne years with the legislature, and that was the governor's responsibility to act on bills as the Constitution had posted within 10 days of a bill's being presented to him. That was the constitutional formulation. And what people on the outside might have imagined is that when the legislature passes a bill, it sends the bill over to the governor's office, and then he has 10 days. This is what all the League of Women Voters civics textbooks would tell you, to either sign or veto the bill. But the practice had developed that the bills would not be sent over to him. They would not technically be presented until he called for them. And Byrne sat on bills for weeks, months. Sometimes there were a few that went into the next year, the second year of a 2-year session, without action, till they had long, in some cases, passed the moment when their effectiveness was required. If something was urgent, rather than veto the bill, the governor would just not call for it, and the time period in which this supposedly urgent, time-sensitive legislation had to be enacted would be passed, it would be moved, and then when the veto would come, it was already past time. The legislature responded in 2 different ways. After Merlino became president of the Senate in 1978, he incorporated a rules change, or one Senate agreement to a rules change that authorized him to, as president, to deliver the bills upon passage unless the governor sent a message asking for them not to be held. So something that would create a presumption that they should be delivered. It may have been a little bit weaker than that, but basically a statement of an intent to present bills and not be left victimized this way. On the Assembly side, Al Burstein thought that the way to deal with this was to require the bills to be presented but give the governor 45 days rather than 10 days. So this became an inflexible tool. We had some success on the Senate side during the period of in which the rules change was adopted, at occasionally surprising the governor's staff with a bunch of bills being delivered that they then had to run feverishly around to get a quick decision made on and some action. That was a major piece of legislative power if the legislature chose to do that, but it was done even on our side only episodically. It wasn't done in the Assembly. They didn't have the balls, frankly, to do this wholesale. And so where they showed their coglione, in a sense, was in voting for Al Burstein's constitutional amendment proposal that we resisted on the Senate side because we thought it was both inflexible and that it was a diminution of legislative power, because you were withdrawing from the legislature the discretion as to when to present the bills, and you were giving the governor a month and a half pass. You weren't able to force a decision quickly on something you thought was urgent. But in the end, because our rules change seemed too evanescent, not sufficiently reliable, and the wave of indignation among legislators against the Byrne administration's abuse of the courtesy of bills not being delivered until the governor was ready for them and called for them, led to the vote on the Senate side in favor of Burstein's resolution as well. And it was presented to the people who foolishly, perhaps, voted for it. And that's why we're stuck with the now inflexible system that, if anything, gives a little bit more leverage to the governor than he had under the old system if the legislature had chosen to use its power to send the bills as soon as they were passed.
And of course, one practical impact of the system where the governor could hold the bills pretty much for an entire session, if he so desired, was that it gave incredible leverage of the governor over individual legislators who had passed bills that were sitting waiting to be called upon in terms of pressuring them on votes for pending
Absolutely. Gave him an ever-accumulating number of chits to be able to hold over legislators. And this is why, frankly, we thought that delivering bills en masse, after a legislative session had concluded to the governor's office, would give our guys more leverage. And if there was a particular case where a sponsor of a bill felt that his chances of getting it signed would be better served by waiting, we could hold it back. But anyway, we've lost, I shouldn't say we anymore, they have lost that leverage. The other big development in the 70s was the creation of longer-term legislative leadership tenure. Until 1970, the Speaker of the Assembly and the President of the Senate served a one-year term and was rotated out. So you had a constant churning of the leadership slate, and no one became entrenched. You did not, and no one became a master of the Senate, Lyndon Johnson style. Ray Bateman broke that pattern when he was elected to a second term in 1971, and then so he served 2 years. And Al Beadleston elbowed him aside before he was going to get too comfortable in the job. But the precedent had been set, and it wasn't set in the Assembly in 71 because they lost control in the 1971 election. And they had to carve out a deal in 72 that gave Kane speakership, but he held it for 2 years, 72, 73. Beadleston became the Senate president in 73, so reaffirming rotation. And when the Democrats then took over, you had a 2-year term. On the Senate side, Pat Dodd for 2 years, and Matty Feldman, and then Merlino locked it down for 4 years. And this then opened the door for what has now become an almost permanent legislative leadership. As long as your party holds control, a president or a speaker is able to hold on unless he has touched off a row in the caucus. And it is further reinforced now by the development of this, quote, no longer new, but the past 2 decades, phenomenon of legislative leadership PACs, in which campaign funding has migrated from the candidates, or as it had been the case in most parts of the state, their county organizations, to Trenton. And this has had profound importance and impact on how campaigns are run, on the centralization of party themes, and the power of legislative leaders over their flock, over their members, rather than the reverse, because they hold the key to the finances that legislators, particularly in relatively marginal districts, need to win election or re-election. That's another huge change. So The 70s were a period in which you had both a stronger legislature overall, vis-a-vis decades before, and also the development of stronger committees and committee chairs. And in terms of the budget, what went into the budget was left entirely to the Joint Appropriations Committee, and the leadership was not involved even as to what went in or didn't go into the budget. So the budget had its own internal dynamic to the committee, and the leadership was basically brought in only for the decisions on what kind of tax package you might or might not need. That was above the pay grade, as it were, of the chairman of the Joint Appropriations Committee and the members of the committee to determine what kind of tax package could get 41 votes, 21 votes. But at that point, what went into the budget was entirely within the committee's domain. And today, to judge from a distance the press accounts of the 2007 budget process, even what goes into the budget was the subject of the three-cornered negotiations among Governor Corzine, Speaker Roberts, and Senate President Cody. So the legislative leaders being involved in that is a relatively new development that represents a change from what prevailed during the Byrne years.
When the 1947 Constitution was put into effect, many political scientists wrote that New Jersey now had the strongest governor in terms of the balance of powers among the branches, and particularly in relation to the legislature. Have these changes over the years since 1947 weakened the power of the governor in terms of the respective powers of the three branches?
Well, actually, I think that in constitutional terms, the legislature in the 1947 Constitution was as empowered as it could want to be. It was incapable of exercising those powers, but it had the power to deliver bills, and the governor had to respond in 10 days. It had complete autonomy, no restrictions in terms of its sessions, particularly in the South and West, viewing the legislature as the most corrupt branch of government, had in the early 1900s imposed very tight limits on how long the legislature could be in session. The New Jersey legislature is under no constraints. The only fundamental constraint is that tax bills have to originate in the Assembly. Not much of a constraint. I think the governor's power that separated him from chief executives in most other states lay in his unique control over appointments and his control over the executive branch, because in many other states you have a number of elected officials who have control over different pieces of what in this state is all subject to the governor. And in a number of states you have entire executive agencies under commissions that are appointed apart from the governor and that are in no way, even though they be executive agencies, are in no way under his control. So I think that his supposedly being institutionally, or she, the strongest governor, is a function of within the executive branch rather than vis-a-vis the legislature. I mean, he was stronger in other states, perhaps vis-a-vis the legislature, to the extent the legislature was hog-tied down to a 6-week session and could only be called back by the governor for a special session any other time of the year. That's a more powerful governor in other states. But that's not something that this governor had.
You refer to the sort of session schedule. To what extent is New Jersey, as a commuter legislature, typically meeting twice a week, not staying overnight in the state capital, different from other states?
Well, it's had a devastating impact on what could be the nightlife in Trenton.
Your hometown.
My hometown. So that would be the one argument for keeping them there. And the Joint Appropriations Committee was perhaps the one place where we were able to keep for a few weeks guys in town with a long day's hearings, and then they would meet the next day and 3 days a week consecutively. But it was only a tiny fraction of the legislature, and it wasn't enough to keep the Holiday Inn open in Trenton into the 1980s. I think that the fact that the legislature could meet throughout the year, even if it's bifurcated in this way, has been a source of strength. And the fact that people, in effect, had a break of a couple days from one day's legislative activity to the next to reconsider, for doubts to grow, for cooler heads to prevail, for a smarter idea for reformulating something to take hold. And when you come back, you're able to fix things. I think it's actually worked well for the legislature. If there was something that urgent, as we saw with the tax package, both in '76 and in 2006, the legislature could meet in consecutive days. But also the fact that the Constitution requires an intervening day to go from second reading of a bill to its third reading unless it's deemed an emergency by resolution with 3/4 of the membership, would require this kind of cooling off period in any event.
Another major change that has impacted the legislature in various ways has been the public concern over ethics and corruption in New Jersey and in other states and
other countries and all that.
At the federal level or wherever, which has led to a series of measures which I guess really began in the Byrne administration to tighten up disclosure and conflicts of interest, and has had some impact, I suspect, on the types of people who decide to run for the legislature and serve. I recall during the Byrne years, I think that Robert Laurenti left the legislature largely because of tightened conflict of interest standards that would have hampered his major law practice in the state.
Bobby Laurenti had already left the legislature before Byrne came in.
But I believe the reason was because of tightened conflict of interest standards.
Possibly, but that would have been conflict of interest standards adopted by the Republican legislature under Bill Cahill?
Well, in any event, let's
No, clearly the conflict of interest issue, the public disclosure, much less Open Public Meetings Act that the just passed Byron Bear had been the dogged promoter of and such. All these found their ascendancy by 1974 when Byrne became governor, because he was succeeding a governor. Bill Cahill had been brought down by corruption scandals, and B, you had the much larger framework of the Nixon Watergate scandals and all of the money corruption scandals that were in the penumbras of it, shaping public perceptions of the loss of integrity in government. And this was a response to it, this public financing and so on. I think that we will probably see a new upsurge in this after the 2008 presidential election, when you will have a rearrangement of the pieces in the American political landscape, probably in a very profound way, and that the abuses that have been become deeply ingrained at the federal level will be seen as something against which at all levels we need to take preventive reform measures. So it's partly a function of where the larger national debate has conditioned voters and politicians to see a need for action, as well as the specifics at the state level.
I guess.
Which also goes back to the question of legislative empowerment. This whole movement in the 70s was really given a huge fillip by the Watergate scandal, and the sense that it was the Congress at the federal level that had to step in when you had a near irredeemably corrupt and sinister executive branch leadership running amok. And that also fed the notion of the whole legislative branch at whatever level having to be more assertive, becoming the protector of the public, and that was quickly transmuted, in the case of, let's say, that Ray Zane legislation, into a plaything of special interests who saw at the state level, and this was going on in lots of states, but in New Jersey, it was much sought by business groups that saw the Byrne administration as likely to use its rulemaking power that the legislature gave it, from hospitals to environment to whatever, something that would tie their hands, and that the legislature could be induced to whoop through a concurrent resolution unthinkingly just by political pressure. So that was all also conditioned in part by the larger Watergate picture nationally, because states throughout the country were trying to adopt these legislative oversight mechanisms that turned out to be a plaything in many cases for moneyed special interests.
Has the cumulative impact of these measures to increase accountability, financial disclosure, bar conflicts of interest, been a good or a bad thing in New Jersey in terms of the types of people who now run for and serve in the legislature?
To my mind, unreservedly a good thing, because the types of people who would run for positions, legislative positions, or even get executive appointments in the past. But let's talk about the legislature. Were people who were often looking to feather their law practice as a side benefit of being in the legislature, or otherwise advance themselves and advance their financial interests. The fact that the quality of who goes into the legislature has, by some accounts, fallen in the past decade or two decades or whatever relative to the 70s, I think is much more a reflection of a generational shift in public service, a reflection of the trauma that the Reagan and post-Reagan era has imposed on perceptions of government service and government's capabilities than it is of financial disclosure. I mean, it is not a coincidence that the people who bridle most at these disclosure requirements are Republican business types who don't want to have their financial business out on the public record. And this has not been as very much a problem for progressive-minded, reform-minded people who don't have such financial entanglements. It's a pain in the ass to fill out some forms. The forms are not that onerous if you don't have complicated tangles of finances that maybe need to be on the public record.
You aren't concerned that there isn't a higher percentage of what we might call professional legislators who now, given that legislative salaries are somewhat higher than
respectable,
they were
right,
in the 1970s, plus positions such as in labor unions or as teachers and such, are able to blend particular professions with their legislative salaries to sort of make the legislature a way of life.
They always did that.
But in different roles.
You had, perhaps lawyers did it more then than lawyers do it now, but you've always had that. I mean, if the complaint is that you now can get people from more modest incomes serving in the legislature, what's wrong with that? If anything, that would make, if it were actually true, it would make the legislature a little more representative, a little more, authentically representative of the population for which it is making laws. I don't see that as the problem. I don't see that as the problem in terms of getting getting the best people nominated for office. I mean, the real question is, who wants to go through the hoops to run for the legislature, And it usually means going through the hoops of the local parties. And in many counties, that's still the county chairman for nomination. And who wants to go through the hoops of having to try to raise money? That's the big discouragement to political service now, for those who actually are starry-eyed public interest servants. It's having to raise money. And I think that the experiment in so-called clean elections that Maine has pioneered, underway in Arizona, and that, and forgive my use of the vernacular, in a half-assed way, we are experimenting with in a couple of selected districts in the 2007 legislative elections, may actually be a very instructive study in whether financing is or is not the problem that many imagine it is in terms of the kinds of people that you bring into public life.
Some have suggested that the clean elections movement really protects incumbents because the amount of money to mount an effective challenge is so high. You agree?
Well, it depends on the amount of money that you're going to offer in a publicly funded context for the two sides. Frankly, incumbent state legislators, while they have some name recognition advantage, it's not as if they are legends in their community. They don't have the franking privilege that U.S. House of Representatives members have to put their name in front of every voter in their district umpteen times a year. So they are dislodgeable if the party balance within that district is close enough. And we have seen elections in which you have huge tidal waves that wash out both the dead wood and the green when a big issue animates the voters. And that's tended to be a little more to the disadvantage of Democrats. Those tended to happen to the Democratic side more than the Republican side. But you can get wipeouts.
Well, you may have indirectly answered this question already, but redistricting and the power to carve up new districts after each census has become almost a science compared to what it was, I guess, in the 1970s, although it was obviously important. But has that so protected incumbents that you think that some new system in New Jersey might be experimented with that would develop maybe a more objective process outside the partisan balance?
By the way, we should, now that you have mentioned redistricting, not forget in a moment to get to the Byrne years congressional redistricting adventures, both the failed one in '74 and then the one that was adopted late at night just before Brendan Byrne left office for the 1980s.
Well, let's stay with the legislature.
No, I want to. I just want for both of us to remember that one, to come back to it. But we're talking now in much more broad terms of the impact of the redistricting system on the character of politics in Trenton. The fact is that it is very hard to devise a districting scheme, even if one had this as its goal, to shake up the political system by making as many districts as possible highly competitive, just by dint of political preferences of voters and where people choose to live or are forced to live or whatever, to be able to make a 40 district legislature with 40 highly competitive districts. And so the system that we have now does tend to create a few more districts favorable to one party or another than you could, if you really wanted to make them 50-50 across the board, then you might be able to create.
Why don't you explain the system?
Well, You have to get 40 districts, each of which is geographically contiguous within its, for all of its constituent voters. Fit them into a map that gives you, 40 senators, 80 assemblymen, and when you have, as in Newark, there's no way you're going to be able to create politically competitive districts between Democrats and Republicans in Newark. And there's no way out in Sussex County, Warren County, that you're going to be able to create a district in which Democrats will be competitive. So you're going to have, at each extreme, you're going to have X number of districts that are going to be lopsided. Now what we have is a system in which a legislative reapportionment commission composed of 5 people picked by the Republican State Party chairman, 5 people picked by the Democratic State Party chairman, sit down in a room together and carve up the state. They're naturally both have the same goal, which is to screw the other if they can, and to create districts that protect, or that give them as many likely winners as possible, and create firewalls against the possibility of a 1991 style blowout or a 1967 style blowout, and that give them as much of a shot at being able to knock off one of the other side's members as possible. That is, to create as many, a Republican strategist would be to try to create as many very weakly Democratic districts as possible so that you can be competitive in those districts and minimize and try to concentrate as many areas where you have Democratic voters, pack them into a 10 or 12 Democratic districts. And on the Democratic side, they would want to do the same to the Republicans, to get Morris County and Sussex, to give them every possible Republican town and a handful of districts and make as many that are competitive where a Democrat would have a shot at winning on their side. And since both sides have exactly the same goal, in the end they very quickly decide that they will create 12 roughly districts that are impregnable for each side. And then because you have half the state that is really mixed, you're going to have maybe another 6 districts that would trend Democratic, 6 districts that are created that lean Republican in a bad year that could flip, however, but you're hoping to build the firewalls there. And then it leaves you with basically 6 to 8 districts in which the Democratic-Republican spread is maybe 0%, that is 50-50 to 55-45 that are in play. And that is where the leadership PACs funnel all the money they can shake down from lobbyists and interest groups. Those become the big battleground districts. So you have basically 8 maybe, that are battleground districts. And then you have that rare bird every legislative election cycle in which there actually are local circumstances that put a district in play that would otherwise be viewed as cut and dried. And in the 2003 elections, that was the case in the Monmouth County, Western Monmouth County District, District 12, where John Bennett's much commented on ethics issues changed what was viewed as a pretty safe Republican seat into a highly competitive one in which the Democrats were able to clean the Republicans' clock that year, and in the 2005 Assembly election held on to one of the 2 Assembly seats. But the system basically is intended to create perpetual control for the largest number of districts, but you're not going to be able to change that even if you wanted to. You could make a few more districts competitive. But when I look back on the Byrne years, who were the legislators who were the most vigorous reformers? Of course, this now reflects a liberal democratic bias. Merlino from the totally, what was viewed until Jerry Stockman lost it, the totally safe Trenton-based district in Mercer County. Mattie Feldman in the most democratic, although upscale, Fort Lee, Teaneck, Tenafly district in Bergen County, and Al Burstein and Byron Baer on the assembly in that district. Bill Hamilton out of the New Brunswick district. Many of your best legislators were those who came from safe districts, best in the sense of vigorous reform promoters. Now, from a Republican point of view, the mirror image would, I guess, be a Jerry Cardinale. That is, you have, for hardcore Republican arch conservatives, you can only find those people elected in very safely Republican seats, and in districts that are a little more competitive, like the 13th in Monmouth, Middlesex County. Joe Carrillos would be, he's conservative, but he's certainly well protected on flanks, is reasonably moderate. In that district, you have Amy Hanlon now, Assemblywoman, again of that kind of stripe. That those districts tend to push people a little bit to the center because you need to guard your flank against a possible upset. But the other major transformation since the 60s of the past 4 decades has been the sorting out on ideological lines of the two parties in ways that you did not have then. And this also reflects in part perhaps the financing realities of centralized control, centralized campaigns. The fact that the legislative leadership and state committees now offer the preset package. If you want their money, you take their consultant. Their consultants have already come up with a standard campaign format in which 90% of your campaign is going to be the state committee package. So you don't have to think of issues because the state committee or the legislative leaders' PACs have already decided on it for you. This is a huge transformation of politics, legislative politics, from the 70s.
I take from your tone you don't see that as a positive transformation.
I don't.
Do you want to expand on that?
Well, I think that any imposition of uniformity from a top down thwarts the democratic will, in a sense, and the democratic competitiveness and the need to regenerate political talent locally, because fundamentally this is all moved at the national level. It's all moved to Washington. Here it's moved to the consultants' offices, the cluster around Trenton. And I don't think that that's a good thing. I think the loss of autonomy locally is a problem. You drain some of the potential richness from the political system.
And of course, as you mentioned before, this, at least in part, was generated by the exceptions carved out in the campaign fundraising legislation for the leadership PACs, which allowed them to become new centers of financing for individual legislative district races.
Absolutely. In the 1970s, legislative campaigns weren't anywhere near on the scale of expense, in part because party organizations still were the kind of automatic pilot mechanism for running campaigns, and nobody went to Trenton to raise money. Now, where does the bulk of campaign finance come from for a legislative candidate? Well, you have a couple interest groups that will lavish money on campaigns, real estate, in particular development interests. Those are the biggest. Then you have the professional associations, but they are Trenton focused. In other words, that money comes out of the Trenton-based lobbying offices. And that's something that I don't think legislative candidates thought much about 35 years ago, raising money out of the lobbyist community. Now, it's like a mini picture, black and white reprint of the Washington style centralization of politics, and that makes the candidates have to dance to the tune of the capital agenda rather than their voters' agenda. And that's what I think is potentially interesting about these clean election schemes, because you have to go back to the average voter and somehow craft a message of interest to the voter rather than what can or can't be said in political circles and fundraising circles in the Capitol.
Let's go back to another area of what in the 1960s and 70s was viewed as a positive area of legislative reform that we talked about in terms of professionalization of the legislature and the expansion of staff capacity, some of which may have been generated by Professor Alan Rosenthal's work here at the Eagleton Institute. We've heard during the course of these interview sessions a couple ex-legislators expressing, perhaps with nostalgia, that this hasn't been the greatest thing over the course of time in terms of putting a wall between the elected legislator and constituents, and also making the role of the legislator less important than it used to be in terms of hands-on experience with legislation and negotiating amendments and so forth. What's your take on it?
I'm sorry, I don't see the criticism that nostalgic former legislators have for the current system, because there's too much staff. The staff is doing it all.
Too much staff, and the staff is really doing a lot of the contacts on an individual constituency basis with the people that they report to, and that their role in terms
this is
of
part of the
mechanics
centralization.
of the legislature is weaker than it used to be.
This is part of the centralization within the leadership of control over the committees and such. And I think, but that is not an inherent change in having staff. It's a question of where the legislators have allowed, the members have allowed their leaders to direct them more. When we pioneered a partisan staff person on the Central Senate staff tracking, having responsibility to track a particular committee, this was not to be the staff aide for the chairman, but having somebody at each committee who would be able to let us know, and so the central leadership know what was going on in the committee, to be able to report on what the debate was within the committee on each bill that was now coming to the floor. So then preparing bill comments to inform our members of the implications of what legislation, political implications as well as policy implications might be, we would know in advance and have some sense. Because at least at that point, committee chairmen and members turned to the Office of Legislative Services staffer, nonpartisan, generally smart and well-educated, for their advice and for the substance of the legislation. And indeed, our staff representatives with each of the committees would also go to those same OLS committee staffers to be sure they understood what the legislation was, and to be sure that they had all of the dimensions of the bill that legislators would need to know. I remember once David Friedland coming in shouting at me that our bill comments had not warned him of X or Y or Z in a particular bill, and he, after he votes for it, he then got holy hell, and that we had failed in our job, at least on that bill, to warn of what the implications were. And so we dug out the bill comment, and in fact, the bill comment had already indicated that there was this issue about which members might want to to think. I think that over time, the bill comments have since become much more agents of propaganda for a leadership position, and they've lost some of the kind of warning function, but that's also a question of who's doing what job, and whether the membership is satisfied or chooses to complain about inadequacy and all that. I don't know now what the situation is in terms of the partisan staff people's relative control over the process. They were not involved, except for me personally. The people with the committee staffs or with tracking the committees were almost never consulted by the committee chairman in terms of what should go into the legislation or what shouldn't. That was a legislator to legislator decision. So it is possible that now you have an excessive power in the staff that in a sense also mirrors the gargantuan tendency in Washington of congressional staff to acquire disproportionate influence over the legislative process.
Another area in terms of the relationship between the governor and the legislature is the selection of legislative leadership and what role the governor, if any, plays in that. Perhaps most recently we saw Governor McGreevey intervening in the selection of the assembly leadership. What do you recall of the Byrne years in terms of the governor's input, if any, into the selection
The
of
governor's
leaders?
input was first, and I think only, manifested in the deal that fixed the two houses' legislative leadership going into 1974. That is, he was involved in what became the leadership lineup on the assembly side of Howard Woodson as Speaker, Joe LaFonte as Majority Leader, which was interesting because LaFonte had been part of the group of 4 Hudson Democrats who had gone over to elect Tom Kean Speaker the session before. So this was itself a curious kind of re-embrace back in the fold by being rewarded with the number 2 position. And I think it was Bill Hamilton as number 3. And on the Senate side, Pat Dodd, Matty Feldman, who had been out of the legislature for 6 years or whatever, now bouncing back as majority leader, and Joe Merlino as assistant majority leader. That was carved up with the governor and Jim Dugan as a way of satisfying all of the major blocs in the legislature and people who seemed entitled to a leadership role. After that, each house went on its own way, and refresh my recollection if I'm wrong. I don't remember Byrne, having had the clout to be able to try to affect a leadership fight when LaFonte then ascended to the speakership for who would then become next in line. I mean, Bill Hamilton moved up to become majority leader, and it may have been Burstein at that time. He may have gotten a little later. It may have been, and then he became assistant majority leader. And then the Senate side, that ladder moving up, Byrne was out of it. Byrne was out of it after the '77 election. This 2 houses proceeded on their own. I don't recall him as being able to influence who came in at the number 3 slot to get on the legislative ladder at that point, because it was all just a question of moving up and moving the presiding officer out and the next one moving up.
To the extent that you know, and you may not know, do you believe the arrangement with Hudson County was part of the Byrne campaign and Byrne's own negotiations for their support in the 1973 election?
Well, the fact is that Hudson County had a major block of legislators. They're going to have to be taken care of somewhere in the legislative leadership lineup when you have Democratic majorities. and Byrne presumably owed them something, but you couldn't avoid them anyway. When you came out of the 67 election gave you the contours of where the Democratic heartland was, because the only counties that had any Democrats in the state legislature or in the state Senate were Hudson, Middlesex, Mercer. And then you had a number of Essex County people in the Assembly, but in 67 they lost all the Senate seats, believe it or not, in Essex. So that was the heartland, and those were the places from which, when the Democrats finally came back in, you would have the natural recruiting ground. And lo and behold, those are the counties from which the legislative leadership was recruited for that slate that came in with Byrne, with the exception of Mattie Feldman representing a newly empowered Bergen, where we had 8 of the 10 assemblymen, 4 of the 5 senators. So Bergen was entitled and had to be part of that legislative leadership team. But just think, we don't think now, as we did then, of these are the blocks of votes that have to be accommodated, and then you figure, well, who from each of these blocks are the best people? Now it's much more driven by by personality first, and then you look at getting some balance lower down the legislative leadership slate. In fact, even in 73, the fact that a relatively mid-sized county like Mercer would have a speaker, that's why Merlino was bumped down to assistant majority leader, because although he felt more entitled to be majority leader as an incumbent senator, have been quite active in the campaign. A county like Mercer can't claim 2 of the top 4 seats in the 2 houses. But the fact that he was there at all was a sign of even then, the personality was a driver, but the exquisite balancing politically. And that's why after Pat Dodd stepped aside, the person to follow behind Merlino moving up the ladder as assistant majority leader was Joe Maressa of Camden County, if you remember Joe Maressa.
Later, Governor Byrne's relationships with the Hudson County leadership become more complicated. What do you recall of the genesis of that?
Well, let us separate out his relations with Jim Dugan from Hudson County, because his relations with the Hudson County delegation as a whole, particularly on the Assembly side, I recollect as being good through the first term. You then had the political convulsion in Hudson County in 1977, in which Paul Jordan and his team and his legislators are all sent packing, and Tommy Smith becomes mayor, and his legislators, Wally Scheel and so on, come in, and they are not on the same team in a sense. So they have to be wooed, they have to be mollycoddled, they have to be brought along, they have to be courted in a different way. So are you talking about the Jim Dugan problem?
Well, let's go back to the Jim Dugan relationship. How do you recall the tension starting? Was it mainly personal, political? How?
This is something which I was like on the outside the third circle, if you will. So my vague impression of it at the time was a sense on Jim Dugan's part that as state chairman, person responsible for the party, he was entitled to be at the table when a whole set of political decisions are being made, and was consistently excluded in favor of the unelected, non-political Leon and Caden and the others inside the governor's circle, and that if he wasn't being admitted to the inner circle, then he was going to make plain that there were ways in which you had to pay attention to him. And this seemed to us to produce the response from the governor's side that we're not going to be pushed around by the likes of Jim Dugan, and we'll make clear that if you're not playing on our terms, you're not playing at all. And then that led to this downward spiral. And when Jim Dugan abetted the slaying of the income tax in the summer of '74 in the Senate, you then had, Cold War, if not political hot war, between them that was to last until Jim himself was removed by the electorate in Hudson County for a renomination.
Let's move from the nitty-gritty politics back to the higher plane of the institutional relationships. We've talked about the legislature and governor's relationship. The Supreme Court, starting with the Cahill administration and moving into the Byrne administration, was a driver of policy on significant matters, particularly Robinson Cahill, but also on the Mount Laurel land use and low-income housing decisions. As a liberal Democrat, I assume that you were pretty much in tune with those decisions, but institutionally, looking back over the many years since those decisions came down, has the impact been good or bad in terms of the institutional position of the court? Is there skepticism now that the court's attempts to develop policy haven't really worked out over the years in terms of schools and estate planning and low-income housing?
Well, certainly it hasn't happened in terms of low-income housing because the court itself then backed off and accepted half measures during the Kane years, when Kane insisted on these community RCAs. The
regional contribution.
Yeah, regional contribution agreements. That's right, as the escape hatch for municipalities having to provide for their assigned fair share of low to moderate income housing. And the court, recognizing that it had pushed itself into a thicket where you had huge and potentially politically arousable public resistance would jeopardize the court, backed off and agreed to accept the halfway measures. Although the court still, I would argue in an environmentally disastrous way, foisted the builder's remedies, if it be a remedy, on as some kind of device, but the builder's remedy was never exercised on behalf of low-income people. It would be exercised on behalf of moderate-income people, important enough, but it has not succeeded at all in changing the very color-sensitive, not color-blind, pattern of residential settlement and new development in New Jersey. On the education side, the court's decisions can be faulted not on legal grounds, as I think that legally, the court was doing what the court must do, which is to uphold principles that may not be popular among the well-off, in terms of insisting on adequacy of school funding resources for kids in poor districts. That was absolutely right. There is maybe the policy question as to whether such equity produces results, and conservatives would argue that you get a lot more extra brain power cultivated by putting money into rich kids' education than you do putting the same amount of money into some poor slob kid who doesn't have the wherewithal anyway. But fundamentally, that is a very racist kind of argument, or not necessarily racist, or classist argument. And that if you don't buy into that argument, then there is no alternative but to go in the direction the court has gone. And you will have more conservative-minded folks, especially whites, saying, requiring money to be spent in Newark to be equal to what we spend in our districts is just throwing money away down a rat hole. But you can't seriously argue in legal terms that kids in poor towns should have less money for their education. I don't think that that's discredited the court, and that's why even when you had Republican control of the legislature and the arch conservatives on the Republican side were pushing for an amendment to be put on, a constitutional amendment to be put on the ballot to eliminate the phrase thorough and efficient. That was their silver bullet cure for the court problem, that even Republican majorities didn't want to go there.
Could the court have fashioned a different remedy in the Robinson-Cahill series of cases that, with the benefit of so many years since, been more effective in terms of a result?
It was the legislature that fashioned the remedy. It was the court that decreed the parameters and what had to be the goal, but it was the legislature that fashioned the remedy.
Well, let's put the question on the legislature, particularly in terms of the focus on dollars and equalizing spending among the poorer and richer districts. Was that a mistake?
If you're asking whether whether it was a mistake to have poorer districts getting getting at least the statewide median dollar amount of financing, no, in my view. Now, as I said, I've already indicated that arch conservatives would say, yes, it was a mistake because those people, the money is wasted on, in their view. Yeah, I think that that's a repugnant view. And is it a mistake to have resources going to where the educational deficits are greatest? I don't think so.
How about a remedy?
But that's you're talking now about policy. We're not talking now about the institutional issues.
No. But how about a remedy would have focused more on the geography of the system? For example,
Carl Marburger, when he was education commissioner in 1967 under Governor Hughes, floated a suggestion about the geography of the system, namely suggesting that we might need cross-district busing for racial balance. That deals with the geography of the system. That became the single biggest Republican legislative candidate campaign theme for that fall's election. And together with the Newark riots as the backdrop, probably did more to unseat Hughes's 2-to-1 Democratic majorities and install 3-to-1 Republican majorities. I don't think the voters then wanted to go there. I suspect you'd get a fair amount of resistance if you were to propose that kind of geography, the racial geography solution today.
Well, if the court then had...
In our, as U.S. Chief Justice Roberts suggests, our colorblind political institutions.
But if the court then had focused more on the racial issue and simply mandated county districts, do you feel that the political backlash would have been so severe that either...
Well, the court was focusing on financial resources, which have been the central argument brought in the Robinson case about the inequity of the finances. And to say that finances are not crucial to education is a fantasy. Wealthy parents know that finances are important because they will spend $25,000 a year to put their kid in a private school because they figure that that is worth the investment. Money does make a difference. Wealthy parents don't send their kids to private schools that cost $4,000 a year. So money is relevant, and it wasn't the court's job to decree county-wide school districts. That would have touched off a far more furious reaction, because what's the constitutional basis for a court decision that you don't want locally based schools? The court found the unconstitutional and the unequal application of existing school finance laws. Perhaps they might be bolder on finding an unconstitutional consequence of relying on local municipal lines for the formation of school districts. But I don't know if that case has been brought in those terms. In any event, we're talking now about the merits of educational policy rather than about either governmental branches and institutions.
Similarly, on the land use and low-income housing side, would the court, again, maybe focusing more on the local powers over development and zoning and housing development, taken a different approach, which would have said, well, that power should be more in the county, so you had a broader geographical base in terms of land use development in New Jersey, had a more positive long-term effect in reaching the goal of expanding?
Well, that is what the legislature might do. That's not what I'm not sure why the court should say that the existing laws empowering municipalities to make decisions on what will be built where and how you will zone locally, why that should be done by the county rather than the municipality, would give you or would guarantee a different outcome. And the issue had been that municipalities deliberately zoned and continue to zone for higher end housing, and many of them make no provision at all for low or moderate income housing because they don't want those kinds of people within their borders. So if that's the problem, then the remedy doesn't have to involve a larger scale change, which the legislature is perfectly free to adopt, but within the framework that the legislature has already established of local zoning, you simply correct the constitutional defect of zoning at the local level being used to exclude people on grounds of income. The legislature retains the right, and if a governor had the balls, the governor has the right to call on the legislature to change it to a county-based system or to have a stronger state directive role. That's in the political framework, and the court is the place, I would think, to which you go only when the political process and the application of the laws is clearly discriminatory and is used to deny the rights of the citizenry or part of the citizenry. So I think our court in New Jersey, which has been much maligned as activist, has been quite prudential. Well, becoming too prudent now, perhaps.
Well, that was one of my next questions. In the 1960s and 70s, the court was led by some prominent Chief Justices, including Joseph Weintraub, Brendan Burns' mentor, and former Governor Hughes, who was appointed as Governor Cahill was leaving office. And we've discussed that appointment with Governor Byrne. But they were two very prominent figures, and the court institutionally was viewed with great respect, I believe, in New Jersey, maybe even intimidating the legislature, and also had a very strong relationship with the governor, because you had a former governor who was Chief Justice, and with
but also a former county chairman.
Right.
That's right. Somebody exquisitely sensitive to the politics.
Yeah, and of course, during the Byrne years, you had a series of appointments of governors' councils to the Supreme Court, and also Governor Kane appointing his policy director to the Supreme Court. So you had a very strong relationship between the governor and the governor and the Supreme Court. and sometimes ganging up, I guess, against the legislature in terms of pressuring the legislature to do things that politically the legislature really wasn't prone to do on its own. But let's talk about the...
Well, I would fault that piece of analysis only because even when you had a governor who wasn't interested in seeing that done, you had this forward momentum from the court. I mean, Mount Laurel got played out to a fair degree in the 80s under Chief Justice Walentz, when the Kane administration would have been just as happy to have this go away. So it wasn't that it was hand in glove with the executive branch, but rather that you had people on the court of generally high caliber and of very sharp legal understanding, who believed in the rule of law and in the rights embedded both in New Jersey's Constitution and the federal Constitution, and that the laws have to protect those rights and uphold them. And the court has continued to be an actor in this front, even when the political signals out of the governor's office, and the most conservative governor that we've had has been Mrs. Whitman in the past half century, and the court would still press the envelope. So I don't see this as inherently a ganging up against the legislature, because in a number of cases it was also ganging up against a governor who would rather not have had to deal with this problem.
Well, I guess that...
But the Byrne years were exceptional in the close compatibility of both ideological and legal views and political will.
Well, that leads me to ask about the situation and relationships today. Do you think that the court's institutional role has been weakened, and it may not only be in New Jersey? There's been a national attack against judicial activism, at least at the federal level, a series of appointments of federal judges who have followed a conservative political philosophy. But in New Jersey, has the special history of the impact of Robinson Cale, of Mount Laurel, led to where the court today could not make the types of landmark decisions that it was making in the 1960s and 1970s?
Well, I think the political climate has been, how should we put it, more cautionary for the court in terms of taking bold steps. Although, given that social issues have become the, and this actually I think may tend to confirm what you're saying as much as the point that I thought I was about to make, with the gay marriage case before the Supreme Court here. The court was 3 steps ahead of where political opinion might be on this. The court's decision was Solomonic in that you had a unanimous view that you could not have a different kind of legal protection system for couples that were not married, that were not heterosexual, as opposed to those that were. But they were willing to give the legislature the way out of creating marriage with another name. And 3 of the 7 justices even wouldn't give them that much leeway. That's the kind of so-called bold issue. Now the question, I think, going back to what affects people's wallets, what affects people's sense of community identity and personal identity, will be how the court will respond to the continued failure of the promise of Mount Laurel, and whether it will re-engage in that in some way, and how it will continue to deal with the issues of education finance. And I think it's going to continue in small ways to press the envelope, but it may be that the big cases are already behind us, that period of from the late 50s through the beginning of the 80s, of identifying one area after another where palpable injustices were being done through the politically agreed arrangements, have largely been addressed. in terms of economic and education policy. I don't worry about the New Jersey Supreme Court becoming a rubber stamp for special interests, the way the U.S. Supreme Court has become.
Before we lose track, let's go back to talk about the congressional redistricting that you mentioned before during the Byrne years.
Yes, indeed. Well, there was the 1974 effort that failed to get agreement on a redistricting plan to replace the one that had been imposed by a federal court in 1972, which had been a Republican plan that Republicans in the Senate, led by Majority Leader Joe Mariziti, had pressed and passed, but which died in the Assembly. And the Assembly, because it was basically 40-40, didn't pass any redistricting plan, so the federal court imposed the one that had passed one house. And the Democratic members of Congress hated that plan and were anxious to change it. There was a famous meeting of the Democratic members of the congressional delegation with Byrne. I don't know whether you have talked with him about this for the archive. Do so. And if any of the surviving members of the then congressional delegation are alive, it might be worth getting their views. But as I recall, and I was like 5 layers removed from this, so this was just State House gossip after it happened. Pete Rodino was insisting on on redividing Newark, because Newark had been under the Republican plan put all together to keep all the blacks in one district, and that was still Rodino's district. And Rodino, who was just at this moment basking in his new role of savior of the Republic vis-a-vis Nixon and Watergate, was demanding that Newark be redivided so that he would have a large black minority, but going out into the suburbs. And this was something that, in its ramifications rippling down toward the rest of the state, was threatening to imbalance some of the others. And Frank Thompson, who had, as often happened in those days, perhaps tippled too much at the meeting, shouted he was some kind of, I don't know whether he used the term guinea, but cocksucker. Quote, end quotes. This is, and this was, I think, in the Prince at the time. In any event, you could not get agreement in the delegation on a plan, and so none was offered and none was passed when you had huge Democratic majorities. As it happened, the Republican plan, nonetheless, had stretched Republicans a little too thin for the 74 Watergate blowout year, and Mariziti himself lost the seat he had just created for himself 2 years before to Helen Minor, and I think we picked up Andy McGuire that year and Bill Hughes that year. So you had 3 Democratic pickup seats in what were supposedly Republican districts, all of whom survived at least into a second term. So then you come to 1981 and the redistricting. And this was one in which an assembly aide to Dick Coffey, Peter Curtin, and Tom Lindenfeld became the geniuses, the sinister geniuses, some would view, of redistricting, with the primitive computers available at the time, coming up with maps that, in order to address Jim Howard's concern about having almost been beaten in the 1980 election by Assemblywoman Marie Mueller in a district that was essentially all of Monmouth County, wanted to get the Republican towns, well, he had a lot of Republican towns, to get the most Republican towns out of his district and to get Democratic towns in from Middlesex to bolster him. In the end, we had the creation of a map with a so-called flying swan, the northern part of the state, that was to be the ultra-Republican district, stretching from Ridgewood all the way down along the Delaware River to Hopewell Township, Mercer County, with a body of a bird in the Republican heartland of Morris County. You had the fishhook, which came out of Elizabeth, reaching out to any kind of moderate
or reasonably balanced towns through eastern Somerset, Middlesex, into Monmouth to Manalapan and Marlborough. That was intended to create a district for Adam Levin, and this was a sign of how money influenced or contributions, because he had contributed very generously to the Union County democracy. The Union County senators in Trenton insisted that he had to have a district that would not have Matt Rinaldo, the incumbent, living in it, but moving Matt Rinaldo into another district. We put two Republicans against each other. This was the most wholesale case of ultra-partisan redistricting. And a bill was passed, and then because of some little question about the Burlington County and whatever, we then passed, in the waning hours of the expiring legislative session, a bill to revise it, just switching a couple towns around the 4th District and Camden County District borders, that was passed, amending that first bill. And Byrne vetoed the redistricting bill, and I forget on what grounds. He vetoed the first one in order to try to, I think it may have been to try to force a change in the Adam Levin district. I'm not quite sure what it was. Do you remember what it was?
Was it Joe Minish?
It may have been that. And of course, and the legislature was unable to, and Tony Russo would not, from Union County, and Alex Menza would not budge to reenact the bill with his changes. He conditionally vetoed it. That was right. He conditionally vetoed it, and the Union County folks wouldn't accept it. So the Republicans thought they had won, that Byrne had overplayed his hand, and so the new Governor Kane was going to have a big hand in this. And just before the inauguration of Kane, Byrne then signed the second bill, which had been sent as one amending the first one, but which was legally valid, that he had had in effect as his insurance for the bold strategy of trying to veto it. So that created a plan that on which the 82 election was fought. And here, once again, the laws of unintended consequences. It was set up to create a district for Adam Levin. He lost that election. To make the 4th District impregnably Democratic in order to knock off the fluke Chris Smith and Joe Merlino failed in a 57% Democratic district to win, to beat Smith that year. And of course, the courts got involved because of a feeling offended by the maps. That then moves into the Kane administration.
Let's move back to the chronology that we left quite a while ago. The income tax is enacted.
We get through the 77 campaign without any taxes being necessary. We have put New Jersey's fiscal house in order, AAA bond rating. New Jersey's in great fiscal shape. Governor wins re-election, surprises everybody, go into a second term, halcyon days. A little bit of this fiscal house in order turns out to have a little bit of a sandy foundation in one corner, because we end up with a budget deficit looming for the 1980 legislature to have to deal with. And so in the dead of night, between Christmas and New Year's, essentially, after the 79 legislative election, we rushed through a package of tax increases on the corporate income tax.
Well, that's too much of a fast forward.
I know, but I just want to get that's going to be the only financial side thing to talk about, and that gets then that then sets the administration up for being able to go serenely through the remainder of the second term without any fiscal crunch. So that the whole second term looks financially stable with that one little kerfuffle that nobody but the corporate sector was aware of.
Okay. But going back to the 1977 campaign.
The campaign itself, mere politics now.
Where Governor Burns starts out with many people thinking he will not seek re-election given his low approval rating.
23%, I think it was.
I believe so. What was your own take on that?
I thought he was a dead duck. I thought Paul Jordan offered the best hope of being able to continue Burns' progressive legacy, since he was clearly washed up. And he was clearly drawing a whole set of sharks into this primary. Favorite sons, Roe and Florio, and the whole bunch of them. And Ralph DeRose was coming back too, as I recall, right? Mm-hmm. And Byrne makes the decision, nonetheless, that he will run again. And Dick Leone calls to ask if I will come up to Morven and meet with him and Byrne. And right. So suddenly I'm impressed into the campaign. Somebody whom I liked a lot but viewed as political dead meat.
Was it a reluctant volunteerism on your part?
Well, once you're asked by the governor, and once Dick outlined why he thought it could happen, well, if it could be done, this guy deserves it.
Were you
more than anybody else.
convinced by Dick's presentation?
Well, I was convinced enough to think that that there is enough of an outside chance. And after all, he had asked, and Jordan never had, which also matters. And Merlino then encouraged me, absolutely do it. I'll give you the leave of absence from the Senate staff to do it.
What about Joe Merlino's personal beliefs about Brendan Burns' electability?
Well, as he told me, stranger things have happened than a guy in this guy's condition being able to pull it out. And Joe was quite loyal to Byrne and liked him.
We're going to have to take a break to change tapes.
Okay.
Let's move on and talk about the 1977 campaign in more detail. We had started, and you had said that you didn't believe that Governor Byrne had much of a chance for re-election, and that...
Well, what did I know? I was, 27 years old, so I had not lived through these things before. But the conventional wisdom was one that you had to be unusually bold and farsighted to disagree with. But the governor decided he was going to do it again. And when you looked across the field, other than Paul Jordan, who was essentially in the same wing of the party as Byrne, you were getting other pretenders, all of whom looked less appetizing in one way or another, and of uncertain conviction. I mean, Jim Florio, from a very safe district in Camden County, had voted against the income tax bill in 1974 because he was running for Congress that year, and it would be politically difficult. We needed, of course, we wanted a Democrat elected to beat John Hunt in the first district, so everybody would give him a pass. But it wasn't exactly a profile in courage, right? So, and you look across the others, I mean, Bob Rowe, Ralph DeRose, Joe Hoffman, the great defector from the governor's own cabinet, who combined the worst interests of labor and industry in the department of which he was commissioner as his kind of campaign direction. since environmental concerns were not exactly at the top of the list for Charlie Marchante and the AFL-CIO. So you look across the spectrum, and just in terms of ideological perspective, in terms of vision, in terms of progressive instincts, Byrne still ranked high. And the only question was whether you jump off a horse that you think is already sinking to the bottom to find one that's almost as good, or whether you think this horse can make it across the river. And as I said a moment ago, Dick Leone managed to make enough of a case that it could be done, Paul, that you're flattered to be asked me to be the issues director, but still Dick was going to be the issue strategist. And Joe Merlino, offered the benediction to do it, the blessing to do it. And I'd still have a job with the Senate and, come the day after the primary. So, yeah.
This may be an unfair question, but you mentioned that Dick did call and Paul Jordan didn't call. What would you have done if Paul Jordan had called?
Oh, I don't know. But that would have had to have been much earlier. I mean, this was amazingly late that we are getting, that the governor is stepping into the race at all. This is, if I recall correctly, I have this meeting in April of April 77, because the filing deadline was like second, third week in April, I think. And this is just a couple weeks before that the governor is going in quite late. Now, correct me, when did he announce? Maybe this is March. 30 years, people can forget the placement. But since I recall walking outside on the grounds of Morven with Dick, it wasn't cold.
Do you think that his delay in announcing a decision was a strategic move, or was it simply uncertainty as to what he really wanted to do?
Oh, I would think it would be the latter. But he would know. I mean, what do I know? So whether it be late March or early April or whatever. And then you have to play, at that point, the game of trying to line up county endorsements, which, they're still helpful, but as I recall, one of the reforms was this before or after the 77 election? To eliminate statewide candidates from being on party lines, so that they would all be off together. Do you recall when that had been adopted? Was that applicable for 77?
I don't remember.
It's worth looking into.
Now that you are issues director, what is your day-to-day role?
Day-to-day role is to be able to supply to the candidate the kind of issue themes that should be talked about and background information on them. Although, of course, he has the entire state government, or those few people, perhaps, in the state government who are still politically loyal to him, to draw on for much of the substance. But then, second, to prepare the issue content for the campaign's dialogue with the voters, particularly the major literature pieces. And we did one big piece. I remember Joanne Finlay was aghast when she saw this. This was it's almost inconceivable today, given the ever shorter attention spans that we imagine voters to have. But this was almost a newspaper, big print newspaper, that became the standard piece for the Byrne campaign and the primary, the major piece. Can you imagine what 4 more years of Brendan Byrne would be like? The top headline of the page, of the fold-over kind of tabloid. Bottom, look at the last 4, and a picture of Byrne that was enigmatic as to whether this was a pro-Byrne or an anti-Byrne piece. And then identified what we were to argue were the major promises of the 73 campaign and how they had been delivered on. And we were told by campaign county leaders from some of the northern counties at least, that they detected a major shift in the more upscale towns among Democratic voters from this piece. Any event, it was a part of our work was to try to frame what the substantive issues of the primary campaign were for Democratic voters.
In developing the larger strategy for the campaign and the theme or themes that you wanted to emphasize.
Dick and behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz, David Garth.
Well, I wanted to explore that, particularly David Garth's role. We've heard in earlier interviews that Garth, in the primary season, wanted to take a very low profile.
Shooting Star Enterprises was the name of the dummy company that was created to film the one TV spot that the primary campaign ran. And this was one in which Byrne, I think we had him standing at the steps of the Trenton War Memorial looking back to the State House dome. Says, 4 years ago, something to this effect, 4 years ago, I said that we needed to reform New Jersey's tax system, and that was right. I also said that I didn't think we needed an income tax, and I was wrong. But what we have done is X, Y, and Z. It was a 30-second spot. This was supposedly eating humble pie. David Garth was there for the production of it, but was otherwise totally invisible. On primary election night, when Byrne unexpectedly wins the primary, suddenly he puts out to the New York press that he was the guy who had done this. But till that moment, it was Shooting Star Enterprises, whoever they were, who were the contractor to do the TV ads.
So I guess the assumption was that David Garth thought that Brendan Byrne's prospects in that primary were so dim that he didn't want his name associated with
a defeat. He wanted a string of victories. Right.
What personal contact, if any, did you have with David Garth during the campaign?
Basically, as the person in the room next to Leon, because Dick would do the strategy discussions, who would have the facts, the issues, what could go into a commercial later in the fall campaign. And there we had a much wider range of both issue pitches and issues that would be developed. Because the primary, you basically had to crack public opposition or hostility to Byrne based on his on the income tax, which is what I think that one TV commercial helped do. Then to win the general election campaign, you had to talk about a much wider range of things. Now, many of those had been foreshadowed in the print piece we did for the primary. And we had a variety of pieces, particularly on the tax issue, focused on the blue-collar and poorer towns that were the major property tax reduction beneficiaries. A series that was adapted for each town, like Trenton taxpayer, because of the Byrne tax program, the average house in Trenton, which is valued at X, had a tax cut of X number of dollars. And you had that similar kind of flyer with the numbers plugged in for the one, and only paid, given the average income of a Trenton homeowner is Y, only paid so much in income taxes. You did this for dozens of towns, larger population centers. So you had a whole tax portfolio, and then you would do environment, and you had some other issues as well. But taxes were the one that this election was going to rise or fall on.
In making the decision to confront the tax issue head on and to have Brendan Byrne somewhat apologize
Eat
or
humble pie.
say he was wrong. Was there any debate among the key insiders as to whether this was a good strategy or whether you should try to focus on other issues apart from the tax?
Well, for the primary, there was no other issue apart from the tax. If you had to persuade Democratic primary voters that what was the one big issue that everybody associated with Brendan Byrne was not a loser, and that he hadn't tricked people, because that was the fundamental issue for Byrne, the suggestion that he had tricked people in the 73 campaign, that he had willfully misled them. I see no need for an income tax in the foreseeable future. So you had to deal with that. And also you had some of the free press opportunities, because May of 77 became the time at which the Atlantic City casino bill is signed with a great flourish and a parade. It actually got a fair amount of media coverage, insofar as anything gets media coverage in television markets that serve New Jersey. So you had some good free media things that began to come along, that began to fall into place. But you had to deal with the tax issue. There's no doubt that it was on that hostility had been built up to Byrne. And if you turn that around, the rest of what Byrne had done in office, people, when you told them about it, they liked it. They admired it. So clearly that's the one thing you had to deal with.
You had mentioned the several candidates who challenged him in the primary. Did you think that as the primary election came closer, that there would be more of a movement for some of the weaker candidates to fold their tents and back other candidates who looked like they would be more serious challengers to Governor Byrne?
Well, the only one who folded his tent was Paul Jordan. And he folded his tent after the, May 12th, May 14th Jersey City election, in which his entire slate was wiped out. And he realized he didn't even have his Hudson County base. Because for all the other candidates, the question was, how much of a primary election turnout can I get in my political base of support? Because this is a field of 8, whatever was the number of candidates, and it would take only 20% to win this. And in Jordan's case, it was clear that without the Hudson County base, he didn't have it, because basically he was, for voters outside of those who knew him in Hudson, in the competing for the kind of voter that Byrne was competing for, and there weren't enough of those to be able to carry him across if Byrne already had them, or had a good share of them. So everybody was basically figuring, let me keep my own base and accept Joe Hoffman, who instead of a regional base thought he had a labor union base that might carry him.
The Jordan campaign largely collapsed because of local issues and his failure to, as you pointed out, solidify his local base. If he had not suffered that defeat in May, how do you think things might have worked out? Would the vote have been split so much between Byrne and Jordan that one Bob Rowe or one of the others?
I don't remember the numbers from the primary in Hudson County in 77, but I think Byrne did well there. And had Jordan remained in, Jordan would have done well there. As it is, Byrne's lead statewide over the next candidate was, respectable. I don't know whether it would have held up as well with Jordan there, if Jordan had been there.
But returning back to the question about the other non-Jordan challengers to Governor Byrne, were you surprised that they didn't get together and say...
Well, none of them, a couple were motivated by animosity to Byrne, and I would assume those were his former Commissioner of Labor and Industry and the one-term former state senator from Essex County. who I guess was not satisfied with the Waterfront Commission as a compensation for having reluctantly backed Byrne in the general election in '73. For the rest, I don't think that they were particularly anti-Byrne, and that for any of them, there's no mileage in backing somebody else rather than Byrne. You may as well stay in and hope lightning strikes. But otherwise, this is a trial run, and you just wait 4 more years.
We've found in our...
That's my guess. Go on. What have you found?
Well, we found in our search of the state archives that you were very active, actually, in coaching in for debates and other public appearances and speeches. What was that like?
You found it in state archives?
Well, in archives at various sources.
Well, aside from finding kinds of useful information about the Republican candidate, because we didn't have debates in the primary, I don't recall. I don't recall any debate.
No, I think this would be the general election.
Right. There, we ran the opposition research into Bateman's long legislative record, and I think we had an earlier discussion about how Ray, I think, has held against me some of the votes that we've found in that long history that turned out not to be quite as saleable to a statewide electorate as they had been to the Somerset County Republican Party, particularly on labor issues and such, because the labor had become a constituency somewhat up for grabs. Byrne was not Charlie Marchante's favorite kind of candidate for governor, but we made it impossible for labor leaders to be able to support a Ray Bateman based on his lifelong voting record. And second, finding this new innovation. We talked earlier about the legislative committees actually working Ray's votes, particularly on the casino control bill. And they were used to good effect, and we'd already discussed that in an earlier session. We basically served to channel the information to Byrne. I don't recall a kind of debate, a mock debate session in preparation, although there must have been one. I can't, in mind's eye, see a place and see who was standing in for Bateman if there was one. But we did much more getting the nuggets of useful information the governor could cite.
Governor Byrne has mentioned, I believe, at the state chamber debate, which I think may have been in Newark, that when Senator Bateman was asked for his position on tax alternatives, and it was his turn to talk, he simply deferred and allowed Senator Bateman to take his time. Was that a calculated strategy that you discussed beforehand, or was it off the cuff? I think
well, it may have been discussed with Dick. I hadn't seen it, and I recall stifling enormous laughter when he says it up there, because it was a priceless moment.
Any others, anecdotes, incidents that you recall from the campaign?
Well, I think that in an earlier tape I had related Byrne's bringing out the vote on conflict of interest in casinos and whatever, so I don't need to rehash that now. Now, I don't recall the tax issue having been a central one in the primary, and indeed, the striking thing was how un-issue-oriented the primary campaign was. The primary election was, frankly, about whether you were for or against Brendan Byrne. And if you were against Brendan Byrne, then you had your local favorite son to vote for. And obviously, the majority of the Democrats were against Brendan Byrne at that point. and would prefer a favorite son, but there were so many favorite sons that the governor was able to win re-election. But I don't recall, and this may be just hazy memory, the other candidates being put on the spot about what they would do about the income tax when the musto provision for its expiration would come due. And it was strangely absent from the debate. That is, none of them wanted to take a position on it, and it wasn't in the Byrne campaign's interest particularly to focus on any of the others at all, or to build up any of the others as an alternative by going after one or the other. Byrne, in that campaign, basically had to reestablish his authority as the governor who made tough decisions, may have made mistakes in getting there, but the consequences were right, and the decision was right, and the consequences were good. And that succeeded in winning, what was it, 30-some% of basically a third primary vote. But the fall campaign was where the alternative kicked in. See, for the Democratic challengers, you really couldn't argue for shifting to something else than what was adopted, because for the Democratic heartland, everything else would be worse. So it was strangely un-issue focused and non-tax focused. For the general election, Bateman was then caught in the trap that Musto had set of having to say what he would do instead.
Why don't we break for this session?